Today, we're doing something really fascinating. We are performing a modern corporate audit, but we're applying it directly to ancient history. We're going to dig into the profound systemic costs of toxic leadership found in biblical texts, just to see exactly what happens to the financial, structural, and human assets of an organization when a leader goes totally rogue. Here's our roadmap for this audit. We'll start by defining the baseline of stewardship, then we'll identify toxic leadership, unpack the human capital crisis, examine lost innovation, look at the erosion of reputation, and finally, we'll cover the ultimate accountability. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the baseline of stewardship, and establishing what the ideal actually looks like. So let's establish our working definition. In this context, a biblical leader is anyone formally recognized to exercise authority, specifically empowered to serve as a steward, not an owner. And that's the absolute crucial takeaway here. Authority is never an absolute possession. It's a delegated stewardship of assets that actually belong to a divine sovereign. When you break down the fundamental economic divergence between these two models, the contrast is stark. A healthy stewardship model is all about multiplying resources for the mission and caring for the vulnerable. But that toxic, extractive model, it literally devours resources just to feed the leader's ego, treating shared assets like personal property. And as you'd expect, that leads straight to misappropriation and a complete erosion of trust. Moving right along to Section 2, identifying toxic leadership, exploring the pathology of the Pharisees and their modern equivalents. It's honestly fascinating how Jesus' scathing critique of the religious elite in Matthew 23 perfectly diagnoses systemic organizational abuse today. Look at these ancient traits: hypocrisy, performative spirituality, gatekeeping, financial abuse, and brutality. I mean, that is a literal blueprint for a toxic culture where leaders look incredibly impressive on the outside, but are entirely self-serving behind closed doors. Now, when we map those ancient critiques onto today's corporate jargon, it's a little eerie how familiar it sounds. We instantly recognize the suffocating environments created by micromanagement that totally stifles creativity, inconsistent communication that just breeds confusion, and narcissistic leaders who constantly steal the credit for their team's hard work. Which brings us to Section 3, the human capital crisis, the scattering of the flock and the high cost of complicity. Take a look at this indictment from Ezekiel 34, because it pulls absolutely no punches. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who fed themselves rather than the sheep. When leaders drop the ball on their basic duty of care, the inevitable result is a massive deficit in human capital, which the text aptly describes as the scattering of the flock. And you have to understand, this scattering isn't just your standard employee turnover, where people leave for a slightly better paycheck. We're talking about a complete collapse of talent management. Your most gifted individuals are driven away by a lack of support and an overriding culture of fear. Failing to support your burned-out team members leads directly to disengagement and a devastating loss of institutional memory. And this environment creates a highly dangerous complicity trap. Toxic leaders actively suppress principled dissenters, and instead, they surround themselves with compliant yes men. The contrast here is wild. You have an unnamed guard who risks his own life to maintain his integrity, flat out refusing King Saul's order to commit atrocities. But then you have Doeg the Edomite. He obeys with gusto, slaughters 85 people, and actively enables that systemic toxicity to thrive. All right, on to Section 4, lost innovation and opportunity, and the real cost of stagnation and risk aversion. Just look at the staggering ratio of risk aversion here. Out of 12 spies sent out to evaluate the Promised Land, 10 of them focused entirely on the obstacles, the giants. They spread a paralyzing panic that infected the entire organization. Only 2 individuals had the faith to focus on the actual potential. They fell right into what's known as the grasshopper mindset. Because the leadership totally succumbed to fear, an entire generation missed their market entry. They essentially mortgaged the future of the nation, which resulted in a massive lost opportunity and literally a 40-year funeral march out in the wilderness. And listen, even the most legendary, highly successful leaders aren't immune to causing massive unrealized potential. The Moses incident is a really harsh cautionary tale. It shows us that relying on old methods and seeking self-glory right at the finish line can instantly upend decades of dedicated service and strategic momentum. Moses disqualified himself at the very threshold simply by substituting fresh instructions with old, prideful habits. Next up is Section 5, the erosion of reputation, or what we might call the blasphemy of the brand. Proverbs 22, verse 1 hits the nail on the head. A good name is more desirable than great riches. Think about a good name as a powerful magnet for top talent and a crucial protective safeguard. It's one of those things that takes an entire lifetime to build, but only seconds to completely destroy. We're talking about a massive reputational liability here. Take King David's scandal with Bathsheba, for example. It resulted in a severe loss of credibility and huge political instability. When a leader's private behavior completely invalidates their public reputation, the subsequent brand erosion weakens the stability of the entire organization. So if we map out this cascading domino effect, it forms a clear narrative of depletion. It shows us exactly how toxic behavior bankrupts an organization step by step. First, extractive financial abuse breaks your foundational trust. Then, that loss of trust scatters your absolute best talent. Naturally, a lack of talent stifles all innovation. And finally, that total stagnation permanently destroys the brand. Finally, we reach Section 6, the ultimate accountability, looking at kingdom splits and eternal accounting. The Rehoboam precedent is basically the textbook example of structural damage. Rejecting the wisdom of older counselors in favor of peers who are urging harsh measures led directly to a permanent geopolitical split of the kingdom. King Rehoboam proves once and for all that harsh, authoritarian leadership doesn't produce strength. It just causes systemic fragmentation and permanently divides your organizational assets. And honestly, the stakes here are terrifyingly high. Jesus explicitly warned that leadership that misleads or abuses a vulnerable flock attracts the heaviest possible judgment. He likened it to being thrown into the sea with a millstone. So the accountability we're talking about isn't just institutional, it is immensely, heavily personal. Well, we've done the audit. We've seen the profound organizational losses today. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. If a leader is merely a temporary steward of human capital, innovation, and brand reputation, how much damage is truly done when a steward acts like an owner?